Hello.
Rik Fox, you got Doug in the Voodoo Lounge. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Doug. How are you?
I'm good, man. How's the weather out there anyway?
Sun is up.
Well, that's good, man. I tell you what, we're getting pelted with snow and wind here. So, but I'm not gonna bother you with that, man. Let's get right to it. I'm gonna ask you just a few things, and then I'm just gonna let you do your thing, man. How's that sound to you?
Sure. Can you hear me fine? Am I clear or
Yeah, man, you sound really good. We should be all right.
okay? Because I'm on a speakerphone.
Yeah, that should be no problem, man. I'm skyping you over here, so we should get a good, clean digital recording.
Good. Cool.
All right, man. And I guess, like I said, I'm gonna fire some stuff off, and you just run with it, man. Whatever's on your mind, let's have at her. All right.
Sounds good.
All right. Cool. Well, then let's get right to the heart of the matter, I guess. Why don't you, tell me a little bit about your first band? How'd that all come about? How'd you get going in the business?
My first band that I actually made my quote unquote professional debut was a group called the Martian Rock Band. So how that happened and came about was I was working as a foot messenger in Midtown Manhattan, and I'm sitting on the front steps of the Seagram's building, which we've seen in tons of movies, right there on Park Avenue around 51st Street. And I guess I'm having lunch or something. This girl walks by. She's got the same haircut I do, and she's like, "You look like two similar creatures in a different world." It's like, "Oh, you have the same haircut. So do I." So we start talking. We become friends, and she tells me about this club called Max's Kansas City, which is downtown from where I was at. I said, I'd never heard of it. She goes, "What? You never heard of Max's Kansas City? That's famous." And I come to find out later that Alice Cooper played there, Aerosmith played there, the New York Dolls. It was a real, underground art crowd, which morphed into the underground music crowd. So I met her down there, and she started taking me and introducing me to everybody and all her friends. So she introduces me to this guy named Sebi Castle, who's now known as the Great Sebastian. He's a psychic and a medium. But back then, he was Sebi. He was the lead guitar player of the Martian Rock Band. I don't remember what sparked our conversation, but we got to talking, and he says, "You know what? Why don't you meet me here on another night, and I want to talk to you about my band." I said, "Okay, fine." So I came down there another night, and we were walking by. I forget the name of the band, but Blondie was one of the backup singers. Debbie Harry. I made I remarked at the singers, and he said, "Yeah, that's Debbie Harry," who eventually went on to become Blondie. Anyway, so we started talking about his band, and he says, "I'm looking for a bass player." And I said, "Well, I'd like to, if you want me to try out, and et cetera and so forth." And I did, and we were a three-piece space rock band, but we were like, Sebi calls it spunk, which is kind of like a heavy metal space punk, kind of that kind of route. I joined the band, and my debut show was with the Martian Rock Band at Max's Kansas City in 1975. And we opened for Neon Leon's Rainbow Express. And Leon was a pretty well-known, popular band in New York, and he came out of Philadelphia. And that's the pictures that I have of me playing on stage at Max's with them. So that's kind of where my debut started. That was 1975. I was just barely out of high school.
Yeah, and at that point in time, unless I'm mistaken, weren't you doing something kind of like a lizard type character, something along those lines, anyway?
Yeah, that came about from our intro song that Sebi wrote was called "Take Me to Your Leader." Well, obviously, a great opening song for a group named Martian Rock Band. And there's breaks and stops in the song where he kind of introduces each of the band members as part of the song. And he says, bass player, he's from Mercury. And I was looking for some type of space persona that I could throw into this because I was really getting into it. And I've always had an affection for and an interest in amphibians, especially, in horror movies. Creature from the Black Lagoon was one of my favorite, monsters. So I tried to put together something that I based off of a sculpture that I did in high school art class, which was kind of like an offshoot of the creature's head. and I called it Saurian Man, which would be like, a man lizard, or, something, a hybrid between human and dinosaur. So I figured, well, I was a big fan of Kiss. I used to watch them rehearse, before they were big, and that's how I got introduced to using theatrical stage makeup. So I sat down. I used to have a little vanity mirror down my basement in Brooklyn with a mirror on it, and I'd sit there and I'd experiment with makeup, kind of like the same way the guys in Kiss did, I guess. And I started playing around with stuff, and I came up with using this cream eyeshadow that had a metallic greenish bluish color to it. So I smeared that on, and I took an eyeliner pencil and I just drew scales on my chest. I went, this is looking pretty cool. So I kind of copped a little bit of Mr. Spock from Star Trek, and I put derma wax over my eyebrows, and I redrew them up at angles, and I filled that in with blue. And because, Gene Simmons spit blood, well, I had to do something too. So I dyed the inside of my mouth green with a couple of drops of green food coloring. So sometime during the show, I'd barf up, puke up what looked like green blood. I think I had like a mouthful of soda or something that would foam. And I just, let this stuff ooze out of my mouth and stick my tongue out. And people would freak, because it wasn't like just blood. It was green. And Sebi had a Flying V guitar that he had bolted on extra wings. You've never seen anything like this. And he used to shoot flames out of the headstock of his guitar. And I said, well, show me how you do that. And back then, magic stores were like a real big hit in Manhattan, and they didn't have really severe laws like they do now when it comes to buying pyrotechnic-related items. They had something called Dragon Flame, I think it was. And it was a powder. It was a yellow powder that when you pour it out on a table and you could drop a match on it, it will burn. It only burns and lights if it's aerated, meaning you have to put it out in the air. So it comes with a little squeeze bottle and a straw. And he would have that on the back, mounted on the back between his tuning pegs, and he'd hold up a lighter or a torch of some kind, and he'd press the bottle with his thumb, and it would shoot the powder out. Then it would, of course, then make this massive flame come out the end of his guitar. Well, I'm looking at this and I go, how do I do this? And I mean, I got to do it differently. And I had these ladies' silver Lene cocktail gloves. And of course, one of my other heroes was Spider-Man. Well, he would push his middle finger in the palm of his hand, and he'd shoot webbing out of his wrists originally. So I got the same thing, and I mounted the squeeze bottle in the palm of my hand under my glove, and I got a cocktail straw and extended the straw up through my index finger and cut a hole in the tip. And I'd sit there and experiment, and I'd just like Spider-Man. I'd push down on the bottle in the middle of my hand and point my left finger, my index finger, and light it, and the flame would shoot out of my finger. So that's what I did, and to use something to light it so that it would be not corny looking like a match or something. I had candles on the outside of my amps like Gene Simmons did, but not as many. And there was another thing called flash paper that magicians used, that they would just, you could light it out of the palm of your hand, and as you move your hand, it looks like flames are coming out of your hand. So I used a candle as my igniter with a piece of this flaming paper, and that would, it was all one move. You light from the candle, turn around, face the audience as the flame is moving out of your right hand, and use that as your igniter with your left hand. And I pull my right hand back, and now I had the flame shooting out of my left index finger. So that's kind of how, I was really getting into the whole theatrics of rock, right at the roots of it, and on a shoestring budget. So, and I think now you have to have a permit, I think, to buy flash paper.
Yeah, I don't think you can even get it anymore.
Yeah, well, I haven't been in a magic shop in years, so I don't know what the current rules are or the laws, but that was what I did. That was my introduction to the professional music scene, and of all places, the legendary Max's Kansas City with the Martian Rock Band.
Very cool, man. Now, I know you mentioned Kiss, and unless I'm mistaken, just from reading, didn't you grow up just down the street from Peter Criss?
No, that's a negative. When I explain this stuff in various interviews, as people read it, and it gets passed from one person to another. It's like musical chairs. The story changes a little along the way. So let me clarify. What happened was Peter's family lived around the corner from me. His mom, his dad, and his sisters, and his brother Joey. So, I'd be out in front of my house, from time to time, and I'd see the family come down the street, walking nice and slow, and going to the store, getting their groceries, and then coming back. And the mother would look at me, and she'd smile, and I'd smile back, and I'm like, well, she's really friendly. The girls, the sisters, didn't look like anybody that came from our neighborhood. They totally looked like outsiders. Like they were not like your standard kids around the block. But, I'd see them playing ball down the end of the block and with each other. And eventually I'd start to walk up there. And one thing led to another. We kind of got introduced and we became friends. And over time, I guess I started dating Peter's younger sister, Joanne. My high school friend, John Alton, and my childhood friend, he started dating the other sister, Donna, who was even younger. And then Peter had an older sister, Nancy, who had a baby, and she lived up there. And then there was Peter's brother, Joey, and he was like really huge into the Stones, and he was an artist, and I was an artist. So we would draw our artwork and we'd compare our work. I wound up going over their house like all the time. I mean, they were just literally walking distance right around the corner from me. And they lived upstairs over a bar in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. This bar is not on every corner, but you would think so. So they lived in the apartment upstairs over the bar, and they didn't have a backyard. What you do is you go out their kitchen window, and there was a roof there that was over a several-car garage. So that was kind of like their yard patio thing, and then it's where we'd hang out up there. And I found out about Peter through their family, and they said, yeah, he plays in some rock bands and stuff. And I think at the time he just came out of Chelsea, and he had put the ad in Rolling Stone for a drummer who was willing to do anything to make it. So he was just very brand new. I knew him just before he got in Kiss, and he'd come over with his wife Lydia Chris, and they'd hang out up there, and they'd put on funny little plays and shows and things like that and make us laugh. And Peter actually gave me my first shag haircuts, so he was kind of like a big brother to me that I never had, and that was kind of neat, and Lydia will validate this. Peter didn't mention any of it in his book, but Lydia has and would validate this. She was there, she remembers all of this, so. And it was nice of her and thoughtful to mention me in her book. So, that's covered. So anyway, that's the story of how I met, Peter and I got to know, he would come by sometimes with Lydia's car, driving to Manhattan to rehearsal, and he'd pick us up, me and the sisters, my friend John, and our friend Anne-Marie from around the corner, and we'd all sit in the car, and Peter would drive us to rehearsal. So we'd watch Kiss rehearse as a three-piece, and this was before Ace got in the band. And then eventually, of course, when they got Ace, so we'd go up there and watch Ace rehearsing. We'd watch the whole band rehearse, and then we'd take the subway home.
That's very cool, man. Did back in those days, even then, were you listening to those guys going, holy man, look at what these guys got going on?
In the early 70s, there really wasn't much of that kind of music around. I mean, you had your Deep Purple and maybe Alice Cooper, but there was no bands that I could compare them to that were as heavy as them, but their hooks and their riffs were as catchy as Doobie Brothers or whatever, anything like that. They just had a very simple rock and roll-y feel, but when you start cranking up the volume, it takes on a whole different perspective. So they had these really catchy songs with harmonies and really cool, guitar riffs and hooks and breaks. And then, they added the whole theatrics to it. So there was nobody you could compare them to. And I would go back to, and this is while I was still in school, I go back to high school, my friends in high school, I go, you gotta know about this band. They're like crazy. And people would say, well, what do they call? I said, Kiss. And they'd all laughed at me. They said, who names a band Kiss? That's so, so fruity sounding. And then after, when Kiss finally came out, a lot of my friends from high school said, you know what? You were right. We should have listened.
Oh, yeah. And when you listen to some of that early stuff with those guys, you know, there's so much hook going on there and big harmonies and everything. And to me, it always sounded like somebody just cranked up the Beatles. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was, you know, some of their biggest influences were the Beatles, you know.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. So anyway, man, you're hanging out, you're doing the Martian Rock Band thing, and now, how long was it in there before you ended up flying out to L.A. and doing that thing?
Oh, there's a big gap in there, Doug. Big gap. I was with the Martian Rock Band until about 1976. I was working in a clothing store in the Village in Manhattan on 8th Street, which was a few doors down from Electric Ladyland Studios. And this guy with long hair comes walking in with his girlfriend one day, and we got to talk and chat and yada yada, blah blah blah. And you know, he says, "Well, I'm a guitar player, and I play in a band in New Jersey called Virgin." And I said, "Oh, that's kind of cool." And he says, "Well, what do you do?" And I said, "I play bass. I was with the Martian Rock Band." He goes, "You know," he goes, "I think we're looking for a bass player." And I go, "Here we go again." I think we're looking for a bass player, you know, line. So we traded phone numbers, and I said, you know, if you guys want to audition, let's kind of do it on neutral ground. I had them come in from Jersey to Manhattan, and I came into Manhattan from Brooklyn, and it was, you know, it was a cover band. It was all of the new wave of British heavy glam bands, Mott the Hoople and Queen, and plus there was Alice Cooper, David Bowie, Kiss material. So you know, I went and I auditioned for them. Long story short, I got the gig, and I wound up joining Virgin. And this was the first band to use the name Virgin, in, you know, in rock in the clubs. And we started playing all the, you know, the Jersey circuit. And this was like before Twisted Sister had Dee Snider. I saw the original Twisted Sister with a different singer and different band members, and they were like the band to kind of compare to. And in Jersey, there was a band like them called Harlow, which was a huge, very popular glam band that was you know, headlining the clubs. So these were the bands that we kind of had to measure ourselves by. So I was with Virgin, and for about within a year, I think they wanted to start over with a new name. So in the interim, we called ourselves Lust, and then from Lust, I suggested Sin, and they said that's perfect. So around 1976, we changed the name to Sin. I came up with a logo, and that's where Sin was originally created and born and formulated, was out of the New Jersey cover band circuit. We played up until around 78, 79, a couple of different member formations, but always the same singer, myself, and the drummer. 79, the band kind of broke up at that point. The singer went off to play drums in another band because he could make more money with them. And I just worked around the club scene in Manhattan. I did lights and road crew work for a lot of bands in the clubs, Great Gildersleeves, a lot of mid-range touring bands who just started out, had their first album out. I would do lights for a lot of these bands. I would network with a lot of people I knew in the record industry. I had a lot of friends in the record industry, and one of them worked at A&M Records. His name was Hernando Courtright, and I was always up at his office, and he would play demo tapes he got from bands all across the country, and he'd say, "Hey, you know, you can look through my closet." And he goes, "I got tons of albums. You pick whatever you want." So that's pretty neat, you know. And I actually went through Hernando to get advice because at another point, I was working in another store a few doors down from Electric Lady, different store at this point now, later in the 70s. And this kid walks in with his friends, and they were vacationing from California. I say kid because they were much younger than I was at the time. They struck me as like a bunch of male groupies or fanboys or whatever you want to call it. And they said they flew in from Los Angeles to see some Twisted Sister show, some pilgrimage. There's a concert going on. And I said, "Oh, I happen to know those guys." And he's like, "You know Twisted Sister?" I'm like, well, "Yeah, why is that so strange?" "Well, they just flew in from California. They're fans. Why would they know Twisted Sister?" So I said, "Yeah, I'm friends with the guys in the band. I knew Mark Mendoza when he was in the Dictators, and he used to come hang out with us when I had Sin when we were rehearsing." So, you know, I had seen Twisted Sister a few times, and I was friends with all the guys except for Dee. And so that scored big points for them. And then they said they were big Kiss fans. Well, there we go. I had to tell the story about how I knew Kiss, you know, what I told you. These guys were all over themselves. I mean, at least the reaction I interpreted from them was knowing somebody who's personal friends with the band is almost as good as knowing the band members themselves. These guys were really excited. And I said, well, I got pictures in my scrapbooks at home of Kiss that I took when they played the Fillmore East. These guys were going bananas already. They wanted to see the pictures. And I invited them to come back to my apartment in Jersey, but they never showed up. What we did do, though, is they said, there's a band in Los Angeles. Here's the tie-in. There's a band in Los Angeles, that we're friends with the band leader. And, what do you do? And I said, I'm a bass player. And they said, hey, here we go. Here's that line again. I know this guy's looking for a bass player. This has been the story, the connecting the dots. Somebody always says to me, I know a band that's looking for a bass player. You'd be perfect. I said, what's the name of the band? And the guy goes, Circus Circus. And I said, isn't there a hotel in Vegas with that name? How can they be allowed to use that name? And I said, I'm sorry, I can't see myself playing in a band named Circus Circus. And, jumping through hoops and elephants and, well, that's clowns. He says, no, it's not like that. It's really heavy. And I said, all right. I reached in my bag. I said, here's a picture somebody took of me playing at a club. I said, here's the phone number, contact on the back. Take this and show your friend. And I figured that was the end of it, And within the month, I started getting phone calls from a guy from Los Angeles. Calls me up. He says, my name's Blackie Lawless. I got a band together. And I said, oh, yeah. I said, that guy that came that saw me at the store, he goes, I don't want to mention his name. He has a cow every time I bring up this story because I can't tell the story without him. So he gets mad when I tell the story without him, but then he gets mad when I tell the story mentioning his name. So go figure. Anyway, this guy, he says this guy gave him the picture, and he says, I said, you got a band called Circus Circus? He goes, well, we changed the name, and now it's called Sister. And I went, okay, well, there's lots of bands already using the name Sister. You got Twisted Sister, and, out in Los Angeles there was White Sister. He says, well, we're looking for another name anyway. He goes, the guy told me about you. I got your picture. You look pretty cool. If you could send me some information about yourself, I'd like to get a little more background on you. And I said, well, I play in cover bands. We don't really have press kits, but I can put one together. And he says, okay, that'd be great. And I said, I don't have a demo tape because what do I need one if I'm playing with cover bands in the clubs? I said, he says, well, we got a tape. And I said, well, send it to me. Let me hear your stuff. So he sends me the tape, and I was blown away. It's a lot of the early, pre-Wasp stuff, that he did. That's on the demo. And I said, yeah, all this stuff sounds pretty good. And he's trying to convince me to come out to L.A. to take a shot and audition. So long story short, too late, I know. He makes an arrangement to fly me out to Los Angeles to try me out for the band. So I bring some amp heads with me, my bass, and some clothes. And, I land in Los Angeles, and he asked me before I got on the plane, he goes, how tall are you? And I said, well, why does that matter? He goes, because everybody in the band's really tall. You have to have a uniform look. And I went, okay, well, I wear boots with heels. I mean, I'm like 6'3" or 4 with the heels, because that's fine. So I get off the plane, I'm walking down the ramp, I come out, I see all these heads with black hair or dark hair standing up like a head taller over the regular crowd of the passengers getting off the plane in the terminal. And I see this one head walking towards me, and the crowd's parting, and that's Blackie Lawless. So that's how I met Blackie. And Randy Piper was with him, and Tony Richards, the drummer, and a guy named Mike Solon, who was driving Blackie around because Blackie's car wasn't working. Mike Solon is a connection, is another dot to connect. He worked with Ace Frehley as a roadie for a while. He was friends with Ace when Ace was in Kiss. So there's the connection of how Blackie knew Ace. And of course, I told him I knew the guys in Kiss and everything at A. They were friends of mine. So, within about a day or so, they took me down to Randy's rehearsal studio in Buena Park. It's called Magnum Opus. And I sat there and I watched them go through the set. And what it did was it immediately struck a chord with me. It took me immediately back to when I was in high school in the loft watching Kiss rehearse. It was the same kind of energy. It was the same kind of feel. The songs were not as hooky as Kiss's, but they had hooks in a different way, and they were still very memorable. And I was just sat there feeling it, and I'm going, these guys got energy. This is thunder coming from this band. I said, if I get the gig with this band, and I don't see why I shouldn't, it would be like jumping into my dream. Being like joining a band like Kiss, at least that kind of power. So they run through the set a couple of times, and they said, all right, come on up. And I went up there, and they showed me the songs, and I played along with them. And I recently found my diary calendar of when I was keeping notes of what was going on from day to day when I was with the band. And it's a good thing I found it, because it reminded me of a lot of stuff I didn't remember. And within like a day or so, I had all the songs down, and I started writing with the band. And one song I co-wrote with Blackie was called Master of Disaster, which over the years I think he chopped up and has now turned into the song called Wild Child. If you play Wild Child and Master of Disaster back to back, you'll definitely hear the similarities. But he does that. He cuts up old songs and reuses them again. So, but of course I got no credit out of that. And as it turns out, this guy who saw me in the store that handed my picture off to Blackie used to come down with his friends, and they'd pull out somebody's drum case, because the other bands rehearsed there, and they'd all sit out in the middle of the room. It was a huge room. They'd sit out in the room and watch us rehearse. So here we are 2 decades or so later. This guy denies I was ever in the band. So, go figure. I have all this documentation and evidence to prove I was in the band, and I got people telling me, out there saying Rik Fox was never in Wasp. He never did. They just get dismissed by people who have nothing better to do, and they got some kind of jealous issue, and their little bands never went anywhere. So they have to try and get their hooks into me and pull me down. But anyway, that's the story. That's the story of how I got the gig in Wasp, and it was called Sister. So about a month or so into being with the band, Blackie's sitting in his living room watching the Yankee game. I got a phone call from New York. I take the phone outside. I'm walking around kicking over leaves, and I step on this one leaf. There was a bug under it, and I kick the leaf over with my foot. I look at it, and it's a hornet curled up, and it's dying. And it reminded me of the old Green Hornet logo from the 60s, curled up with the wings. And I went, I went back in the house, and I said, hey, Blackie, I got an idea for a band name. And he looks up at me and goes, what? And I said, Wasp. And he looks off in the distance. He thinks about it, and he goes, that's a good name. He goes, keep thinking like that. That's a good name. We go to rehearsal at night, and he winds up telling Randy and Tony, we got a new name for the band. And they said, well, what? And he says, Wasp. Tony right away goes, who names a band after a bug? And I go, Scorpions? The Beatles? And Randy goes, well, I wanted to call the band Hellion, because that's what they call bad kids in Texas down south, and call them Hellions. And I said, well, Randy, there already is a band in Hollywood called Hellion. He goes, shit. So, whoops. Anyway, so Wasp it was. And then I found out, much, years later, Blackie was going around saying that he came up with the name, which is not true, because even Randy Piper has validated in his interviews. He goes, yep, Rik did come up with the name. I can't take that away from him. He goes, I don't know why Blackie's trying to take the credit. But then after a few months with the band, Blackie comes up to me one day and goes, I changed my mind. It's just not working out. So, if you want, we'll fly you back to the East Coast, or you could stay out here and take your chances. So he says, but you can't live here. So I had to find someplace else to live and do the couch tour, and he wound up putting periods in the band Wasp and changed it from one word and a concept of an insect to, fill in the blanks, whatever you want it to mean. But he'll never give you a straight answer as to what it means or where it came from.
Right. And Rik, over the years, there's been you and without a doubt, Chris Holmes. And you guys have been pretty forthcoming, with your experiences with Blackie. And he seems to be, less than a desirable guy to be around. What do you think it is that he just refuses to give the credit where the credit's due?
Well, let me see. Chris, when Chris was interviewed for Darren Upton's book, Wasp, A Sting in the Tail, he had a really good way of putting it. He says, there's a tour bus, and there's a guy on the tour bus named Steve Duran. Steve gets out, goes into the venue, goes in the dressing room, becomes Blackie Lawless, goes out and does the show, goes back to the dressing room, and goes back on the bus, and he's Steve Duran again. So, there's some element, I can speculate, that Blackie does not want people to know a different side of him or an inside. It's like keeping people at a distance so that they can't really get to know you too intimately, unless it's on his terms purely and only what he wants you to know. It's kind of like Prince. Prince kind of does the same thing. He plays that media game with the public and with the media, and he doesn't want to talk to people. He doesn't want to give interviews. He wants to be the mysterious guy who's dark and sinister and holds on to some hidden dark secret out of his past or something. It's like, dude, you're not a Marvel comic, okay? People want to get to know you and they want to know more about you. So the more you shut them out, okay, maybe it's working. The more you shut them out, the more attention you're getting by reverse psychology. I don't know. As far as the credit thing, everybody can't think of all the ideas by themselves. When you work in a band, and there's a band collaboration, at least from my understanding, people are going to toss ideas back and forth. When I was still with him, with the band, was when Road Warrior first came out, and there was that promo shot of Mel Gibson walking up the road with the dog next to him, and he had all the torn leather jacket and the tools hanging from him, and I went, that'd be an interesting look for a band. I know there was a band in Australia called Heaven that had a similar look. I said, this might be pretty cool, and I tried to show it to him, and he says, no, he goes, back then, he goes, we're going to scare off the record labels when we're trying to get signed. He goes, let's get signed on the music and work on the image later. And look who's talking. The very first show, he kicks me out of the band, very first show, what do they dress like? Road Warrior, fish hooks, saw blades, barbed wire, torn leather. So, years later, when I spoke with Steve Riley, who of course played with Wasp, he told me that before one of their tours, he says we'd sit down and throw ideas back and forth over what we were going to wear. He says, Blackie, we look at everybody else's ideas and go, no, not that ain't going to work. Nope, not that. No, I don't like that. No, that's not going to work. He'd say, go home and go back to the drawing board and come back again to the next meeting with different ideas. They'd come back, and then when they shared all their ideas, they looked at what Blackie had. He says, Blackie had a combination of everybody else's ideas in his costumes. It's like that. So they were looking for a bass player before they got Johnny Rod, and Steve, knowing me from Keel, and I knew bands that he played with in the Midwest, so he suggested, he goes, hey, I know this guy named Rik Fox. He says, Blackie, he mentioned my name, and Blackie went berserk. He went just completely livid. He says, no, I don't want that guy in the band. And Steve didn't know that I had already been an original founding member with Wasp. So he didn't understand. He was confused as to why Blackie got so hostile just because he mentioned my name. He goes, the guy's popular. He plays around the circuit, and a lot of people know him. He's got the following. Blackie's like, no, don't even bring that guy's name up. So when I explained to Steve about what had happened, he goes, now it all makes sense. Now I understand it. So that's just the kind of person that Blackie is.